For generations, the family-based salt fishery had been an economic and cultural pillar of Newfoundland and Labrador. But that was changing in the 1940s. A new and industrial frozen fishery was gaining ground. In just 2 decades, it would overtake the traditional salt fishery. Changes to the industry and the lifestyles of the people it employed were profound. More and more fishers left their schooners, dories, and punts to work aboard longliners and company-owned trawlers. And they used increasingly efficient gear that could scoop up unprecedented amounts of fish. Back on shore, processors worked in company-owned fish plants instead of on family-owned flakes. And a new product emerged: quick frozen cod fillets. These were mostly sold to the United States, while saltfish had been exported to the Caribbean, South America, and Southern Europe. Another change was in the method of payment. Cash wages increasingly replaced merchant credit. In the early 1900s, some merchant firms in Newfoundland and Labrador experimented with freezing fish instead of salting it. One of the earliest local exporters was the Reed Newfoundland Company, the same company that owned the Dominion's railway and coastal steamer service. After the First World War disrupted European fisheries, the Reed Company started selling frozen fish to Britain. It built cold storage facilities along the shore and used its own coastal steamers to pick up the processed fish and bring it to St. John's for shipment across the Atlantic. But this operation was short-lived. After peace was restored in 1918, British fishing fleets returned to the North Sea and the Reeds withdrew from the developing frozen fish industry. But a small number of merchant firms continued to experiment with the new technology. Among them was Job Brothers. By the late 1920s, they were shipping frozen salmon and blueberries to Britain and the United States. The industry was growing, but at a slow pace. It didn't really take off in Newfoundland and Labrador until the 1940s. In that decade, a set of circumstances gave the frozen fish industry the boost it needed. Freezing technology had improved dramatically, the United States emerged as a lucrative market, and the government threw its support behind the growing industry. Early methods of freezing fish were not ideal. Once the product was thawed, it often turned into a pulpy and unpalatable mess. But by the 1930s, the American inventor Clarence Birdseye developed a quick freeze method that resulted in a superior product. Once thawed, quick frozen fish largely retained its original shape and texture. It also tasted almost as good as fresh fish, but with the added bonus of having a much longer shelf life. There were other technological advancements too. The expansion of road networks and the rise of refrigerated trucks and railway cars meant that frozen food could be transported with relative ease. Freezers and refrigerators were also appearing in grocery stores and in household kitchens too. All of this made frozen fish increasingly attractive to consumers. In 1939, the Second World War broke out. Once again, Britain's wartime demand for food imports created a sudden market for Newfoundland and Labrador frozen fish. Between 1939 and 1945, the Dominion exported 10 million pounds of frozen fish overseas. After the war, the United States emerged as an important and stable market for frozen fish from Newfoundland and Labrador. America, with its enormous consumer base and strong dollar, was of tremendous appeal to local industry and government officials. It would ultimately replace Europe, South America, and the Caribbean as the principal importer of Newfoundland and Labrador seafood products. The Newfoundland and Labrador government was enthusiastic about the frozen fishery. The Commission of Government hoped the new industry could solve several problems endemic to the salt fishery. Foremost among these was the credit system. In the spring, merchants gave fishing families gear, food, and other supplies on credit. Then the fishers paid them back with cod in the fall. Ideally, the fishing families produced enough cod to pay off their debts and then get even more supplies for the winter, but the credit system was far from ideal, and many outport families fell into debt. This could happen for a number of reasons. Fishers might not catch enough cod, or they might produce a low-quality saltfish that was not worth very much. In contrast, the frozen fish industry paid workers with cash instead of credit. Government officials hoped this would break the cycle of poverty associated with the credit system and increase standards of living. The Commission of Government also supported the industry because it was more closely regulated than the salt fishery. Saltfish was produced on thousands of family-owned flakes scattered along the coast. The final cure could vary tremendously from one family to another. So could the volume of fish produced. But in the frozen fishery, processors worked in a handful of large company-owned plants. The quality and quantity of frozen fish produced could be tightly managed. The government encouraged firms to join the new industry, and between 1943 and 1949 loaned more than $800,000 to companies involved in frozen fish production. After Confederation, the Canadian government assumed jurisdiction over the fisheries harvesting sector, while the new provincial government maintained control of the onshore processing sector. Both levels of government continued to support Newfoundland and Labrador's growing frozen fish industry by developing educational programs for fishers, giving loans to fish firms, and helping to build better vessels and fishing gear. The inshore salt fishery was a seasonal, family-based industry. Traditionally, men caught fish in small open boats, while women, children, and older male relatives split, salted, and dried the fish on land. The transition to a frozen fishery dramatically changed that way of life. Instead of trading cured fish to local merchants, inshore fishers sold fresh fish to company-owned processing plants for cash. Advances in harvesting technology also introduced changes. By the end of the 1960s, many inshore fishers had replaced their small open boats with larger decked vessels known as longliners. These could travel further afield than traditional inshore boats and allowed fishers to use a greater variety of gear, including gill nets, long lines, and cod traps. Change also occurred in the processing sector. Instead of drying saltfish on family-owned flakes, processors worked on assembly lines in company-owned fish plants. Unlike work on the flakes, which was often near the home and allowed workers time to take care of children and do other household chores, work in processing plants was closely supervised and frequently involved shift work. But it paid cash wages, and that gave employees, many of whom were women, new financial independence. Change also occurred in the offshore fishery on the Grand Banks. In the salt fishery, crews traditionally traveled to the Grand Banks in wooden schooners. Once there, they rowed to the fishing grounds in small open boats. They caught fish using hand lines and returned to the larger vessels several times each day to unload the catch. The fish was gutted, split, and salted at sea. But as the fishery shifted to an industrial frozen fishery, company-owned trawlers appeared on the Grand Banks. They were larger, stronger, and more efficient than schooners. It was the appearance of factory freezer stern trawlers in the 1950s that truly revolutionized deep-sea fishing. Equipped with quick freezing facilities, cold storage units, and automated filleting machines, factory freezer trawlers could harvest more fish than ever before and process it at sea. The first one arrived on the Grand Banks in 1954. It was a British vessel called the Fairtry. Soon, hundreds of factory freezer trawlers arrived on the banks from all over the world. Northern cod catches rose dramatically and peaked at 810,000 tons in 1968. The cod stocks could not withstand such intense fishing, and catch rates declined throughout the 1970s. By then, the salt fishery had all but disappeared. The province began producing more frozen fish than salt fish in the mid-1960s. And in 1972, saltfish accounted for only 8% of its groundfish landings.